Okay, so now we're recording. Welcome everybody. Appreciate you attending. Appreciate you taking the time to join us for the conversation. Today we're going to be talking about 4 priorities of organisation design. I'll share some slides in a second, but just wanted to do a quick introduction before we get started. My name is Matthew Emerson. I'm the Managing Director at Blackmore 4, and we are specialists in organisational design in the context of high performance organisations, and our areas of specialism cover leadership, management and organisation of people. And today we particularly wanted to reflect on things that we've observed through some of our research, interaction, client feedback, just general observations about the way in which organisations are designed, should be designed, and some key considerations. I will share some slides. As I say, feel free to interject along the way. I'm not precious about being a presenter. If you want to interject, have a different point of view, that's fine. I will leave some time at the end as well if you want to ask any questions, or if there's any particular areas you want me to get into more detail on. So hopefully you can see this. And I say 4 priorities, and I mean that as these are 4 things that we've observed, not necessarily the 4 priorities. There are obviously a number of things to consider when you're embarking on organisation design, and so what we've taken is really the themes that we've seen, particularly over the last 12 months, but I think increasingly over the last 5 to 10 years, of things that are important to the effective functioning of an organisation, but often overlooked, or often maybe misaligned with outcomes, and business outcomes in particular. We're very much focused on performance and results, so a lot of our thinking around these topics is about how do we make this effective, how do we make sure that we've got some predictable outcomes, reliable outcomes that are intended for our business success. So just to set the scene, what we're covering today, I will talk through the 4 themes that we've observed and explain a bit about what we mean by those. We asked for some feedback from a few people in terms of where you'd like this conversation to go, what specifically you'd like to see us cover, and in particular in the context of an article we've written, something around the ability to design your organisation around the increasing need for an agile plan. And I say agile with a small a, I mean that as an agile strategic plan, if you like, and something that's able to flex and meet the demands of whatever context you're operating in. And also specifically the need for decision, as we called it. Decision making is difficult in times of uncertainty, but what we'll talk about here is how the need for effective decisions goes hand in hand with how we organise effort and organise people to be at their greatest effect. So we're going to cover those few things. We'll start by asking a couple of questions, and you can say interject or add some comments as we go. So first off, I think the questions that and anybody who joined our last webinar, you may recognise some of the themes in some of these questions. But what we're trying to get to is does your organisation operate effectively? I think sitting on this call now, maybe take some time just to think through these questions. Do you feel confident that your organisation operates effectively? Are the people in your business organised around priorities? And I mean that genuinely. Do we organise our effort? Do we organise the skills and capabilities, the ways in which we work together around the things that we intend to produce, or the output that we intend to see, the business results that we're striving for? And I referred to decision making earlier. Just ponder whether or not decisions are getting made at the right time and by the right people. We often work with organisations where fast-paced decision making is critical, but that potentially where those decisions get made is not always clear, and that potentially slows down the decision making process if people are trying to navigate their way around the organisation. But not every business is geared towards that, so we'll just dig into detail about what that might look like when you're thinking about organisation design. And also reflect on whether or not you're easily able to adapt to changes. Now, clearly, recent events, or not so recent events as it feels like they are now, have meant that we've all had to adapt, we've all had to change to external factors, but also then the operating conditions within our industries, within our specific businesses, as individuals and groups of people are getting to grips with either new ways of working or, as I say, new industry dynamics that mean we have to adapt. and adapt to things that maybe are outside of our control, but also adapt if there's a shift in strategic direction, which ultimately might be provoked by changes in a wider context, but tend to be more within our control. So I think just reflecting on those things for me gets to the heart of, is your organization set up effectively to deliver the outcomes you're looking for? In LinkedIn, we asked this question: who do you think is best placed to determine how your organization can function effectively? Board, management team, employees, or HR were the options we gave you, and a few people fed back on this. I think it would be interesting if you can pop to the chat function, and if you haven't responded there on LinkedIn, maybe just give some initial answers to that question. By board, we mean board of directors, the people who are ultimately accountable for setting direction and making sure that the business is functioning as intended, ultimately, I guess, for shareholders in many respects, but also for the wider stakeholder groups. The management team, typically the group of people who are charged with day-to-day running of the business. Employees, I think, is understood, all of the people that are directly employed and possibly in many different ways engaged in the work of the business. Or HR as, again, a fairly well understood function as an aspect of business. Who's there? Interestingly, when I talk to clients around this, and I talk about who do we engage at what stage of a process. Sometimes organization design does have to fit into process terms. We get some strong opinions that it's definitely not these groups of people. So I'm just interested to understand who we think it might be. I think a couple of you have already just commented on that. From the LinkedIn poll we did, employees come out clearly on top. We had a small number of people give us feedback on that. And it surprised me, if I'm honest. I expected, when we crafted this question, I expected feedback that said the board and the management team. We have people engaged in this topic who lean more towards the sort of broad umbrella of HR or related expertise, and I wondered if there'd be some bias coming through from that HR professionals are the experts on this. But in truth, it's hard to say that one group on their own are going to be best placed to determine how the organisation can function effectively, and in part goes probably to maybe the basis of some of the answers you're giving. To know how people can function best together, you kind of have to know the people, and also then how they're going to function, how they're going to work together, have some insight about them individually, but also then as a group of people, how's that going to work? It's sometimes too easy for a board or a management team, let's say, to look at the business priorities, and maybe those groups are closest to understanding what you're trying to deliver or what results you're aiming for. And think that those groups are best placed. Equally, people like me show up and say, well, we specialize in this, so we might know best. But in truth, without knowing enough about the employees that you have or the type of work that you're engaging people in, it's quite difficult to make sure those decisions are valid. So without wanting to sidestep the question, my reflection on this was actually there needs to be components of each of these groups involved, and people from around the organisation involved in figuring out the best way of organising effort and capabilities to make sure that you get the best results. I'm going to park there and sidestep out of the presentation slightly because I can hear pinging and an engagement on Teams. So I'm just going to pause, and likewise, as I said, if anybody's got comments they want to share, please feel free to unmute yourselves and comment as well. So I think the management team, just reflecting on your input, management team being responsible for the day-to-day operation of the business, you would charge them with the accountability of organising effectively. I guess my question here really is, are they best placed to understand how that's going to work? You can't arguably organise a business without involving the management team in how that's organised. My point really around employee engagement is not a superficial thing, but really needing input from all quarters of the organisation, and that might include specialist functions like HR, marketing, finance, if you've got specialist skill sets in those areas, as well as the sort of broader operational departments or teams that you have. So decision of how to go forward may rest with a management team, ultimately accountable to a board. But I would argue that if you're embarking on organisation design, either as a process or if you sort of constantly engaged in organisation design, then not having some structured input and structured insight and feedback from employees, you're potentially going to blindside the decision making, if you like, possibly get it wrong. May still get it right. This is not about a perfect situation, but that would be our advice. Somebody can just give me a comment or a verbal comment or a written comment. If you can still see the presentation, it would be helpful to know. Otherwise, I'll cancel it and reshare it.
No, we can still see it, Matthew.
Brilliant, thank you. Cheers. Okay, so that said, the other backdrop, which again, if you've joined one of our previous webinars, this slide will be familiar to you. The other backdrop from our perspective is around communication and decision making and the complexity of organisations. So as you grow as an organisation, clearly the interpersonal relationships and the nature of how people work together grows in complexity. And this diagram sets out only up to 14 people, and we would typically be looking to work with businesses that have more than that, so 50, 60, several hundred people, which you can imagine the diagram gets a whole lot more complicated as you go that big. But just starting to reflect on the fact that when you go from 4 to 14 people, you go immediately from 6 lines of communication to 91 lines of communication, and extrapolate that out. Trying to help people work effectively together is not straightforward. And in some ways, what we see through organisation design as it's traditionally done, and it traditionally is focused on structure first, which again may be an area for discussion, is that we set people apart. We say you're in this department, or you're in this team, or you're in this function, and we start drawing these diagrams, these organograms of how everybody fits together. But typically that leads to separating people and drawing lines between people, as in hard lines between them, rather than figuring out how we make sure that the right people communicate with each other, share information, share relevant information, and can make decisions either as individuals or collectively. So again, your organizations, your businesses are all different. So our intent here isn't to give you a sort of blueprint, here's what you should do. But I think considering the size of your organization, size of your business, consider how complex it would be to try and make sure that all of those people have the right lines of communication to make them, as I say, personally and collectively effective. So I was going to move on just to talk through the 4 areas as the heading goes. There's four priorities, and as I said, I'm really keen to stress we're not saying these are the only priorities.
Matthew, sorry.
Yeah.
The presentation seems to be stuck on the poll.
That's fine, thank you. I just got that Teams message as well. Let me just stop sharing and restart so we can carry on. So everything I just said in the last minute will probably mean not a lot if you can't see that slide. Thanks, Matt. So, tell me, Matt, if you can now see the graphic.
We've got the grids and the lines.
So what I was just saying for the last minute probably won't have made a lot of sense, but what I was trying to explain is that when you grow your organization, and again this diagram only depicts going from 4 to 3 to 14 people, the complexity of the relationships is exponential. So whilst you may have started, if you started a business as a founder or started in a small business with relative simplicity as to how communication works between people, ultimately going up, as I said, to the sort of 40, 50, 60 people businesses that we would work with, or into the several hundreds, this picture just gets complex. So yes, that's the message. And if we organize ourselves in ways that stifle the communication, or that open up, and it is the other extreme, open up communication through all of those lines in one go without any proper thought in it, then we're either limiting the information people have, limiting the contribution they can make, or potentially overwhelming people with information or expectations that they're getting across all of these different lines. So I don't think you missed too much if the slides got stuck two slides earlier. That was the only one that maybe you missed, and this was the one I was moving on to. And it would be helpful, actually, we can distribute materials to participants, but if one of my colleagues could just share the link to this article. So here where it's underlined 4 priorities of organisation design, that's the article that we wrote a few weeks ago that's available. I think you should be able to access it either through our website or contact us, and we can share that. You might have seen it on social media, but that's the basis, if you like, for some of this information in the webinar. So these 4 priorities that we lay out are covered in a little bit of detail there. And today, as I say, I was going to dig into numbers 2 and 3, but just to highlight the 4 in total. When we talk about strategic narrative, I think most people on this call, if I remember, your profiles right, will be familiar with that term. The way we express that as a strategic narrative is everything from your reason for being, the purpose of a business being alive, all the way through to what that looks like in real terms. So that might be around tasks, activities, sitting within a strategic plan, and really the narrative being how that hangs together. And I think, again, in our experience, not to be critical, but I think if we're trying to solve the challenge of organisation design, one of the things we do see is a lot of statements around strategic narrative, maybe not lived, maybe not brought to life for people in the organisation, and certainly the way in which the organisation is set up, both structurally and ways of working, and arguably sometimes behaviourally, culturally as well, just doesn't fit, doesn't demonstrate what is otherwise held as the strategic narrative. So I think not many businesses as of today have the luxury of just being able to start from scratch. We're not here with a blank canvas. You're probably operating in an organisation or with an organisation that already exists and already has some of this. But I think it's worth determining whether the way in which people are organised fits with that strategic narrative. If there is a strategic narrative, I'm making an assumption there. But on the assumption that there is, and that's quite a key component, I would say, of organisational effectiveness, then making sure that the functioning of the organisation is congruent with that, rather than either passive towards it or fighting against it. The reference to an agile plan in the article is really then an extension of what I've just described, but the reality being that if you're operating in, or have been operating in, a context of making 3-5-year plans and having some sort of 3 to 5 year strategic review of those plans, then you're either operating 20 years ago possibly, or in an industry that has very fixed norms and very fixed expectations. Your business may be in an industry that has a lot more certainty to it. But I'd argue the reality of the last 12 months is that pretty much every business in pretty much every industry has had to go back to their strategic plans, change them to some extent, and for many people to a great extent. So that's kind of known. But I think what's maybe overlooked is how we then marry up the design of our organisation against what might be an ever-changing plan. So we don't have the luxury. The world doesn't work anymore in a way that says, all of our conditions are predictable, all of the operating context is sort of set for the next few years. So here's how we're going to organise our efforts. What we need to be able to do is accept that our high-level and detailed operational plans are going to have to change in a more agile way, be more agile, and that our organisation, the way that our people are organised to deliver those plans, is going to have to mirror that. And we can talk about a bit more detail on that later if you want. And the effective decision making I referred to, if you need to be making decisions quickly, but you set your organisation up in a very rigid way, then again, you've got some indication that there's a lack of congruence in terms of what's necessary for your business outcomes and what you're charging people to do. And the fourth point, learning and manage change. Again, I think over the last, in my experience, over the last, let's say 20 years, learning and change management have both been sort of parked on the sides of organizations and really operated as either functions or sort of programs around people or to people. I think we have clearly moved on in terms of our understanding about how people learn and how people both accept and embrace change and act change successfully. But in terms of organization design, my observations would be, I think we're still stuck around learning and change being activities that we ask people to do rather than a basis on how we set people up to work. And that kind of goes back to having an agile plan and making sure you've got an agile organization to fit with that. But as an example, if we follow a very typical hierarchical structure of having finance people work with finance people or salespeople work with salespeople, often as the organization is growing, you're limiting the opportunity for those people to learn from each other. And where change is required is typically, certainly strategic change cuts across many different teams within an organization. And again, if you're not organized to embrace that and to facilitate that, then again, you're off to the wrong start. So that's the whistle stop of the 4. And as I said, I was just going to focus on 2 specific areas, as we're calling it, the sort of consideration of an agile plan and then consideration of decision making. And these are our thoughts and our observations. So if you've come across some examples where either what we're saying doesn't resonate or you've got some contrary views, then again, this is a open conversation as far as I'm concerned. So feel free to contribute those thoughts. So I don't think it's beyond our imagination, if you like, to think that we try and organise people around our priorities. I think that's a fairly well-trodden path. Organising 50, 100, 150 people around anything other than what we're trying to achieve as a business doesn't seem to make commercial sense. And yet there's still a sort of blueprint of how we organise effort that seems to be disconnected from what our specific priorities are, and certainly disconnected from a reality that says our priorities are going to have to change fairly rapidly. And so structurally, when we think about sort of component pieces of organisation design, structurally, how we group people together in teams or departments or functions or business areas needs to be considerate of the business priorities, but also needs to be considerate of the fact those priorities are going to change. So our ability to assemble and dismantle effective teams, subgroups within the organisation, is important, and that also feeds into then how we develop processes and systems that, again, we have come from a history of this linear approach to more process or a wholesale change of process, rather than developing processes and using technology that enable those processes in a way that very specifically meets requirements and can be very specifically changed to meet different requirements as we go forward. So we're still seeing a lot of process improvement manifesting as increased process, increased use of technology in one direction, which when you get to a point where you realize actually your business is now heading over in a different direction, these processes and systems are hard to change. They make any behavioral change difficult because we're locked into highly developed processes and hardwired systems that maybe don't fit whatever comes along, not just once, twice a year, but constantly changing priorities. So third within that is then the collective capability to adapt. I think capability rather than necessarily the will. And this really talks to how we develop capabilities, skills, the abilities of individuals and teams to do our business, to conduct our business and achieve the results. And if we have a plan that is subject to change, then the collective capabilities within our organisation need to measure up to that. And so again, where we've seen perhaps traditional investment in learning and development being maybe around technical, functional skill, and that's clearly necessary in many businesses, and not to downplay the importance of tangible or sort of hardwired capability in the sense of what your business is about. But certainly a lack of investment in developing the adaptability skills, the skills to be able to quickly be part of a newly established team and quickly get up to speed with working with people you've perhaps never worked with before, the ability to understand, I guess, changes in strategic direction and decipher them in terms of day-to-day activities. So I think there are not necessarily, as I say, will or behavioural type, motivating factor there. It's more about the capabilities of your entire workforce to be able to take that new direction and turn it into, okay, we're now going to do something different. And that might be individual learning agility, as I say, it might be strategic agility through management teams. But that capability is critical to making sure that the way in which your organisation functions fits with an ever-changing set of priorities. And then I've referenced sort of motivation and will. I think collective behaviours that reinforce flexibility, how you recognise achievements, how you reward achievements, is important for people's reassurance and, as I put here, reinforcement that being flexible, being adaptable, embracing change and being comfortable with the fact that something new is coming along more quickly than it ever has is important. So again, great to celebrate success in a linear sense. We delivered X, we had great client satisfaction over here, but equally we need to reinforce it's important that we're nimble, and it's important that we accept that things are going to be different, either in role or that we're going to ask you to do something quite different with a different group of people. And I think the unsteady and uncertain nature of shifting priorities sounds hard to keep up with, but the reality of, again, most of the businesses we work with is growth or change in where you're heading, or improving your performance as a business isn't uniform and doesn't come, unfortunately, with a very clear roadmap. And so each of these component pieces, whether it be about your structure, processes you've developed, the capabilities or the behaviours within the organisation, all need to be geared around the fact that those priorities are likely to change much more rapidly than they perhaps ever have. I'm going to stop for a second and see if anybody's got any particular points they want to pick up on there. And my colleagues will maybe be pleased to know that if there aren't any questions, I'm not going to start drawing. I did give myself a blank canvas here to start doodling on. If people had questions, I was going to try and draw diagrams around explaining that, but I might do that later. And look, we can come back to this topic again either later in the call or pick up with it separately if it's something of particular interest. So effective decision making, let's move on here. So again, our thoughts around decision making critically important to business success, to business performance. If you don't make the right decisions, clearly you're finding yourself in difficulty. If you don't make the right decisions at the right time, equally, you may have missed opportunities, or you may be causing yourselves more issues or risks than you'd want. Part of the challenge we see is that it's not always clear who is expected to make which decisions. And I think in the distant past, we probably did put some content out around decision making and which types of decisions should be made where in the organisation, and that being a generalised where. But typically for day-to-day operational decisions, you want those decisions, if they're to be effective and timely, to be made by the people who are closest to putting those decisions into practice. So you would expect maybe smaller transactional decisions to be happening anyway by every employee in the organisation. But what we mean here is really having a thoughtful input into the design of your organisation to say what types of decisions, what is our business, what types of decisions are we expecting to be made, and where should those decisions be made. And that's not necessarily one answer to the question. When we depict our organisation structures, we often revert to this, as I said earlier, this organogram, this hierarchy of who reports to who. That might be helpful to determine line management responsibilities, supervisory expectations, more generalized sort of employment communications, that may work for all of those things, but it's possibly not going to work for everything. And when I talked earlier about different functional groups or different teams spread around the organizations, often the critical decisions that need to be made require input from multiple parts of your organization. And so this isn't necessarily about how you're structured from a management or supervisory perspective, but this is about where are the critical decision processes and how do we make sure that the right people can work together to make decisions in a timely manner, to make sure that the decisions are the best decisions. And that kind of feeds into point 3 here, which is, providing people with autonomy as groups, whether they're self-contained teams or whether they're, bringing people from different aspects of your organization, empowering them to be able to make decisions comes with it a responsibility that they have the relevant information or access to information. And I won't go back to my earlier point, just giving everybody all the information you have and expecting them to make good decisions is probably not our proposed way forward. But I think there is a leadership responsibility and arguably a management responsibility to say, have we put the right information in the right hands? Have we filtered out noise? Have we articulated the specific detail that people need, and usually groups of people need, for us to be able to empower them to make good decisions? And that typically gets us to more timely decisions. And ultimately, there's some decisions that do need to go up the hierarchy, either to an executive team or a board of directors. But being quite thoughtful about which decisions they are or what type of decisions that might be is important in making sure that not everything is getting slowed down because we think there's only, the MD is the only one who can make all the decisions. And then that collective decision making where we require either people from different teams, different functions, possibly different business units to interact to be able to make some decisions, especially again if they're sort of more significant, more complex decisions. It's not enough just to kind of say here's the expectation. We expect you to all talk with each other. I refer to it in the slide as route planning. I think it's without too much rigidity, at least signposting people to say, for these types of challenges, decisions that we embark on, our expectation is that there's, information here or that there's people here, expertise in this part of the organisation. Give it some direction rather than absorbing the decision making into a management committee or hoping that people find each other and somehow help with that decision making. And again, if there's questions, then my response will be to draw a diagram. So for those who want to see my doodling, you can ask away. For those who don't, you can let me move on and happily come back to questions at the end. And look, this is all intended to fuel some more thoughts. So hopefully you weren't turning up today thinking you were going to get the answers to all of your organisation design challenges. I think the breadth of businesses and the representation we have interested in this topic doesn't allow us to say here's your answer and here's your answer, but as I said, these are themes that we've picked up that need more consideration. And there were a couple of questions we had in advance I'll touch on in a second that again may help just think about how you embark on this thing we call organisation design, accepting that there's never really a clean page starting point for this if you're in an existing business. We used this information last time when we were talking more specifically about organisation structures and you extend that to sort of drawing out structure and how that works. I'll come back to that question in a second, Matt. Sorry. And I think I extrapolate these points to not just the structural considerations, but the wider sort of organisation design considerations. So we did have a question about the requirements for what we might call span of control layers within an organisation. There is no one size fits all for this. I can't say here's how many layers you should have and here's a good span of control. Companies like McKinsey will give you some insight into that. I would argue that that's very much dependent on what you're trying to achieve as a business. And what I would say is the span of control. So typically, how many people would you expect a manager to manage? depends on the nature of work. And if that work is highly transactional, highly repeatable, it may be that the supervisory aspect, the management aspect of overseeing that work allows a single manager to have a wider span of control, let's say, a greater number of people. Whereas if the work is highly specialized, complex, often variable, that becomes more challenging in a supervisory sense to be able to monitor more and more people. So you're more likely to see what we describe as a smaller span of control. One of the, I would say, mistakes that bigger businesses make, and maybe you've experienced this as well, is to say that as a business, as an organization as a whole, we expect to see a span of control of X, and it might be we want everybody to manage no fewer than 6 or no more than 8, depending on which bit of research you look at. That might be an appropriate range. It might be 10 to 12 in often call centers. I don't know why I used as an example of where we could have much wider spans of control. I think the mistake is that you end up applying that to all the functions and all the people in your business, and it doesn't work in the same way for everybody. I'm yet to come across a business that is so uniform across sort of side to side that exactly the same type of management and supervisory responsibilities are mirrored regardless of the team involved. So I would say to that, it requires some analysis of what kind of work, what is the nature of management and supervision, to be able to plot that out. And as I say, that is a little bit about structure, but also weaves into how you set your people up to work together, and whether or not you group people in smaller teams, bigger teams, whether you want people to collaborate across function. There's, as human beings, we've all got finite capacity for both in terms of volume and complexity for how we work with others. So I think that requires some thought. And on the second part of that question, or it might be in the first part, in terms of considerations for layers within an organization, so looking sort of vertically, from MD or CEO or executive team to sort of operator, let's say, or whatever hierarchically the lowest level of task is. Again, don't think there's a uniform answer to what that should look like. In my experience, the key consideration there is what you're expecting at each level. And if the way that you've set your structure up means that you've got multiple people operating at a similar level of work rather than necessarily the layer of the organization, then you're potentially going to get quite a lot of crowding, lack of empowerment, lack of autonomy, duplicate sort of application of skill and knowledge that crowds people out. Similarly, if you end up with sort of reporting lines that put person to person significant gap, and you're missing out a level of work in the middle, then you're either stretching people into a space they're not comfortable with, or missing a key link between those levels of work. And when I refer to levels of work, start at a task level, being level 1, process management level 2, supervising others level 3, possibly supervising or managing multiple teams, up to, you could argue different models use different number of levels, but you could argue level 6, level 7 being a wider, maybe even an external industry leadership type responsibility. So I think it's important that you're clear within your own organization what that map looks like, and then really think through how the layers of your organization marry up with the levels of work that you expect. So I think these are the points on the slide at the moment are just important points to consider. Hopefully you can see the alignment in what I've said earlier, as you're thinking through how effective your organization is, where you might need to make changes to make it more effective, and what considerations you take. I'm trying to not drop my phone this time, but let me just come back to Matt's question. You want me to draw, don't you? Can you show a decision process for implementing new ideas? Go on then, let me try and draw. So new ideas, I guess, might be supplemented with creativity, or it might be supplemented with innovation. I think one of the things that I struggle with is if a business says we focus on creativity, we focus on being innovative, and yet still, and I'll draw, if you can see this, and Matt, because you've asked the question, you can tell me if you can see my doodle. Is Matt still there?
Sorry, yeah, I can see it.
Okay, so everybody's now seeing the reason why people don't want me to draw on these things, but this is the starting point of what I see in a lot of organizations in terms of the structural piece, right? So you might have all sorts of different direct reports in different functional groups. So maybe executive team run by MD here, and then you've got sort of senior leaders, and you might have managers or department heads sort of in these roles, and then you've got a plethora of people here. So the challenge I have is that we say at this level, we want new ideas. Great, I want to hear from you, and I want to hear from maybe you over here. But how? Like how do we convey the new ideas? If I'm over here, if I'm person A, and I've got a great idea, so this isn't necessarily the decision, I'll come to that, Matt, the decision about a new idea. But if I've got a great idea over here, who am I communicating it to? The chances are it's either this person who's my line manager or maybe some other people who are my colleagues. But the incubation of that idea is often here and dependent on this person either talking about it with their peers or floating it through their manager. And we end up with this sort of very prolonged, often agonizing process of trying to percolate ideas through this map of an organization that doesn't foster kind of quick thinking, feedback, or any of the ingredients of coming up with good new ideas. And then in the decision-making process, maybe this is successful. Maybe there's somehow these people start talking to each other and they use some of this information, and we say, actually, we've got some contribution from different teams. We've developed the idea. We think we've got a good idea. So to your point, who's then making a decision about the idea? It's not clear to me in this organization how we take an idea from being a good idea. Fine, great, that's a useful idea. How are you going to get it done? Now, in some organizations, you say, we'll just get on with it, right? So we empower everybody to come up with good ideas and then enact them. Well, that's great, but this person over here who came up with a good idea probably doesn't know, well, I would assume definitely doesn't know everything that everybody else in the organization is there to do. So that good idea may be valid, may have come with some good thoughts, but unless you're going to take the time to get feedback from everybody who might possibly have an opinion based on their experience or their role in the organization, it's hard to know. And so what typically happens, again, in my experience, is that you don't make that decision because you know that you don't have all the information, and you end up with this group effectively making all the decisions about new ideas, almost regardless of what they are. And if not, then you might end up with, I don't know, an innovation department sitting on the side here that take responsibility for facilitating that. So I think that's the reality, if I can be honest, about how organizations might want creative thinking and the manifestation of ideas into action and the management of innovation through a process. And certainly if you have an innovation department over here, that's an area of specialism that they could facilitate. But the structural design of this organization doesn't help. It may be the structural design is the right design for supervisory management responsibility, but then somehow through this, what we need to set up at the right level of, not necessarily to the extent of extreme process and system, but the right process and systems, as well as determining some of the right behavioral expectations for being able to share information and ideas across the organization, not just up and down the organization. And that's in danger of looking like a McDonald's symbol, so I'll leave it there. But that as a picture is going to make no sense to anybody looking at it. Hopefully it made some sense as I was going through it. So designing for decision making about new ideas requires some expertise and facilitation of how do you want those ideas, the communication of ideas and the consideration of ideas to be facilitated, either by your own innovation center or by the capability of line managers and leaders to be able to facilitate that, to understand where contributions are going to come from and how to get the best decisions made on those ideas, as well as being able to quickly understand the difference between a great idea in somebody else's business and an idea that's definitely going to fly, or most likely to fly, if we do that within our business. What I wouldn't be suggesting is that we just say creative thinking and innovation doesn't work here, so we're going to restructure the business just around that, because that in isolation is potentially forgetting that you've got many other things that you need to achieve as a business. Matt, I've got no idea whether that answered your question or not, but in some way I hope it covered the right ground. Yes, it did. Thank you. So look, I'm conscious of everybody's time and the need to answer questions if there are any. I don't know if this summary does the content justice, and I hope if only one of the comments I've made have sparked some fresh thinking in your mind and your ability to go and maybe reflect on how your business embarks on designing the organisation, designing an effective organisation, then that's been of some use. Here, I'm really just trying to summarise some of the key points that again, hopefully you can see the relationship between what I've covered separately. We don't have the luxury. I would argue I'm happy to take examples to the contrary, but I am yet to think of a business or an industry that today can sit and say, we have a 5-year plan, we know it's not changing, and we're going to organise our efforts around that. I think the real world situation we live in today, and regardless of pandemic, I'd say that will continue to mean that we have accelerated change and the need for increased strategic agility. I think we need to accept that single hierarchies don't work for all things we want our organisations to do. We are social creatures and organisations are social systems. So how we work together is, I'd argue, has never been, but certainly in today's world, I don't think is dictated by an organogram or a single hierarchy of lines and labels, as we're referred to it separately, but we need to think more carefully and help people navigate the organisation and the expertise within it. I think investing in process and systems, clearly we continue as a whole to invest in technology, but I think the days of almost backing a horse, if you like, and investing everything in that are gone, coupled with the need to accept sort of accelerated strategic change, our ability to rewire, re-engineer processes and implement processes that are fit for purpose, not necessarily to the deepest level possible. And then this last point, which I struggled to articulate in simple terms, and hopefully this will resonate with some people. I think we have shifted from a position where effective organisations are built on finding the right person for each role. I don't think that's applicable anymore. I think roles change as business priorities change, and finding the right people to serve you in a particular role for today will, per the last 3 points, invariably mean that you may not have the right person for the right role in days to come. So I think we do need to shift away from the identity of individuals being about the specific role they play, and accept that if there is a sort of social identity connected with being part of a business, that it is that person to business identity, and that the specific role that they play or the specific team that they're part of is not the anchor going forward, because ultimately we need people to be flexible and adaptable within the wider business framework. And of course, as I've said all along, I'm happy to take questions if you want to talk. I appreciate on these types of events, sometimes it's information overload and sometimes you're just a bit shy and you might not want to raise your voice or pop a question in the chat, but you're welcome to do so. We're here, it's scheduled to be here for at least another 5 minutes, so we can do that. Or you know how to get hold of us. I think all of you will have seen us on LinkedIn, but if you want to call us or email us, then obviously do that, and of course visit our website and you'll find some further information. Just to be clear, yeah, I could talk all day on this topic. I'm pretty sure I could spend my life talking about related topics. I have no issue having separate conversations with you individually about this or things that are related. And we're not a business that works on the clock. So I'm as I say, you may not want to hear me talking anymore, but I'm happy to talk to you as much as you want to talk to me. So if that works for you, then contact one of us and we can schedule time to do that and extend the conversation. And otherwise, as I say, if there's anything you've got comments or questions on, then please raise your hand now. Or not. I'm just trying to check Teams to see if there's anybody. Let me stop sharing the presentation. I'll bring you all back to me. any contrary views, that's the other thing I'm really keen to hear, is where people think entirely differently. We've got it wrong, we've misunderstood, our observations are incorrect. And if not, what you might be interested in is I'm trying to muster the time and energy to finish off another piece of content around change management, which obviously feeds into maybe the fourth topic around learning and change and designing organizations around learning and change, but will be more geared towards effective leadership of change as well. And we'll be hosting a webinar similar to this in a few weeks' time around that subject. So if this has been thought-provoking in any way, then and you're interested in the subject of change and change leadership and effective change leadership, then next month's webinar might also be interesting for you. Look out on LinkedIn for further details, and as I say, just drop us a note or contact us if you're interested in having a conversation separately. And on that note, I thank you for attending, appreciate your time, and I will hopefully speak to you all again soon. Thank you.